Next up is the Environmentally Sensitive Habitat Area Workshop. The presentation will be done by Dr. John Dixon and Dr. Jonna Engel, and backed by popular demand is Aaron Chalmers addressing legal issues. And we also have two guest speakers who John will be introducing these distinguished speakers. I couldn't do their resumes justice, so John will be introducing those speakers. So, Dr. Dixon.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. This morning we will review the manner by which a determination is made that an area is environmentally sensitive and the legal consequences of that determination. This determination is often based on whether the natural resources of the area are considered rare and imperiled by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We're privileged today to have senior scientists from the department with us who will explain how these assessments are made. Dr. Patrick McIntyre is an ecologist who works with the California Natural Diversity Database, which is the publicly available depository for such information. Dr. Todd Keeler-Wolf is a vegetation ecologist who leads the vegetation mapping efforts in California. Dr. Jonna Engel will then review the scientific analysis that staff conducts in order to make ESHA recommendations to the Commission. And Senior Staff Counsel Aaron Chalmers will discuss the legal implications of an ESHA determination. The phrase environmentally sensitive habitat area is not defined in the Coastal Act. However, ESHA is considered synonymous with environmentally sensitive area, which is defined in section 30107.5. Environmentally sensitive area means any area in which plant or animal life or their habitats are either rare or especially valuable because of their special nature or role in an ecosystem, and which could be easily disturbed or degraded by human activities. There are four important elements to this definition. First, ESHA refers to a particular area, not to a species nor to individual plants or animals, but to a particular piece of ground. Second, a geographic area can be designated ESHA either because of the presence of individual species of plants or animals, or because of the presence of a particular habitat. Third, in order for an area to be designated as ESHA, the species or habitat must be rare, or it must be especially valuable. And finally, the area must be easily disturbed or degraded by human activities. Let's look at each of these elements individually. The presence of a species or habitat appears pretty straightforward. However, habitat may be used in several ways. Habitat often simply refers to inorganic physical environment. For example, sand dunes, serpentine soils, rocky reefs, coastal bluffs, or rock outcrops. Habitat can also be an organic physical environment that provides necessary structure for some species, for example, dead wood or leaf litter or tree cavities. Usually, however, habitat encompasses both the physical and biological environment and blends with the idea of a community type. For example, coastal sage scrub, redwood forest, a coastal terrace prairie, or a sand dune scrub. The names of these habitats or vegetation communities are based on the dominant plant species or the dominant growth form which provides the major physical structure, and often also includes some geographic or topographic reference. So an ESHA can be based on either a species or habitat, but that species or habitat must be rare or it must be especially valuable. What constitutes rarity? Ecologists and conservation biologists think of rarity in several ways. First, there is absolute rarity. Some species or habitats are rare in an absolute sense. For example, For hundreds of years, Monterey pine forest has occurred naturally only in 3 small areas in California and 2 islands in Mexico. Many endangered species have been reduced to a few hundreds or thousands of individuals, which is rare by any scale. Second, a species or community may be locally abundant, but globally rare. Some habitats or species, although locally very abundant, may only occur in a few places. An endangered orchid called Yaden's piperia is represented by something over 100,000 individuals, but nearly all of them are found on the Monterey Peninsula. Third, a species or habitat may be globally abundant, but locally rare. Even though the species may not be in trouble everywhere, small populations may be considered worthy of protection, especially if they're thought to maintain an unusual genetic composition. And species that are rare in California are generally considered of conservation concern, even if they are more abundant in Mexico or Oregon, for example. And finally, species or habitats may be geographically widespread, but everywhere occurring in low abundance. Besides rarity, species or habitats may cause an area to be designated as ESHA if they're especially valuable, either because of their special nature or because of their role in the ecosystem. An example of an area that is valuable because of its special nature is land that supports the common native strawberry in San Mateo County. Most commercial varieties were bred from this population, so it constitutes an important natural genetic resource. Another example might be an area with an unusual mix of species, or with a particular high diversity. For example, the botanist G. Ledyard Stebbins called a section of the Monterey Peninsula Evolution Hill because it had such an amazing array of plant species. Through his efforts, that area is now the Samuel Morris Botanical Reserve. There are many examples of important ecosystem functions, the most common of which is supporting species that are rare and imperiled. The threatened coastal California gnatcatcher is dependent throughout its life on coastal sage scrub vegetation near the ocean. And monarch butterflies require groves of tall trees near the coast for wintering habitat. There are many such examples. The final criterion for an ESHA is that the area must have the potential to be easily disturbed or degraded by human activities. This is now universally met. The argument is sometimes made by consultants that species that are naturally adapted to disturbance, or perhaps even require disturbance, should be excluded from ESHA considerations. However, there is a vast difference from requiring the ground disturbance provided by burrowing rodents, for example, and being resistant to the ground disturbance of a bulldozer, backhoe, or plow. Even where the relationships that define an environmentally sensitive habitat area are well understood, delineating and mapping the area is often challenging. Dr. Engel will explore this problem in more depth, but I will address one issue that often arises. Suppose a habitat is critically important to a special species that only occupies a portion of it at any given time. Is the whole habitat ESHA, or only the portion that is currently occupied by the species of concern? Not surprisingly, there is no simple or single answer to this problem. If the special species is constrained in its distribution by other factors, then it might be appropriate to only designate a portion of the habitat as ESHA. But there are other common situations where all the appropriate habitat should be designated ESHA if the dependent endangered species is to survive. A case in point might be coastal bluffs that are home to the endangered Smith's blue butterfly, which is dependent upon two species of buckwheat plants to complete its life cycle. The plants are not rare, but they tend to occur in patches. Some of the patches have no butterflies. Others have butterflies with expanding populations, and some have butterflies with declining populations. Butterflies disperse from patch to patch, but not frequently. The aggregate of all these patches would be called a metapopulation by conservation biologists. In other words, a population made up of subpopulations. In this situation, it's the metapopulation that requires protection, not just the individual patches that have lots of butterflies. All the appropriate habitat within the butterfly's primary range should be considered ESHA, regardless of whether it is used by butterflies at any particular time when biologists are looking. The Commission has taken a similar approach by designating as ESHA coastal sage scrub required by coastal California gnatcatchers, regardless of whether the birds have been observed within a particular parcel of interest. On the other hand, the Commission has not designated groves of trees as ESHA solely because they have the potential to support nesting raptors or wintering monarch butterflies. In such cases where use by rare species is more uncertain, we require the testimony of the animals themselves to tell us if the habitat is both appropriate and important. The Doctors McIntyre and Keeler-Wolf will now explain how the Department of Fish and Wildlife assesses and classifies rarity for plant and animal species and for natural vegetation communities. Dr. McIntyre.
Good morning, Commissioners. It's my pleasure to be here today to share a little bit of information on how species rarity is determined by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Can I have a slide, please? Thank you. All right. So the California Natural Diversity Database and the Vegetation Classification and Mapping Program are two non-regulatory programs in the biogeographic data branch. What we do is provide information on species and communities that is then used in the regulatory and decision-making areas. So the California Natural Diversity Database, or CNDDB, tracks information on individual species. And California's status as the most biodiverse state in North America extends to the diversity of rare species. So on our special plants and animals list, we include over 3,000 species of special status, including 700 plants that occur in the coastal zone and approximately 360 animals that are known to occur in the coastal zone. Dr. Keeler-Wolf will talk more about the Vegetation and Classification Mapping Program, but analogous on the vegetation side, that program ranks and determines the status of vegetation communities, including over 500 vegetation types in 500 vegetation alliances, about half of which are reported from the coastal zone of California. So one of the things that the Natural Diversity Database reports are the various statuses related to rarity. And up here we're looking at a summary slide that shows different statuses related to animals, plants, or communities. The four up top have to deal with legislated statuses or statuses in code. I won't be addressing those very much. So they range from the Endangered Species Acts, the federal and state ones, to a variety of other ranks down at the bottom, such as the CDFW Species of Special Concern, California Rare Plant ranks, and a variety of other statuses from other federal agencies, NGOs, and academic organizations. The three that are shown with red asterisks, I'll be talking about those in more depth since my program is involved in determining those ranks. So the first thing that I'll mention is the category, the CDFW Species of Special Concern. This category addresses a gap, essentially those species for which we believe there's information that they're imperiled or of conservation concern, but are not listed under the State Endangered Species Act. Essentially, these are species that have characteristics such as declining populations, small population size, or high threats that if these things continue, they would be potentially listed under the California Endangered Species Act. Now, how these are determined, this is typically done by the non-game program or the fisheries program of Fish and Wildlife in consultation or in contract with an expert organization. This might be the University of California at Davis, which is working on the reptiles and amphibians species of special concern list, which is due out later this year. Or it might be an NGO, such as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, now known as Point Blue Conservation Science, which worked with the department to conduct status reviews, subject these statuses to peer review, and published a report in 2008 identifying which birds in the state are in the species of special concern category. In terms of plants, the ranking system that is most widely applied for plants in California is currently called the California Rare Plant Ranking System. These were formerly known as the CNPS ranks. So since 1974, the California Native Plant Society has maintained a list of species of plants that are considered rare, threatened, or endangered in California. And I'll walk through an example here. The species shown on the left, the sandmat manzanita. This species is one of many that occurs only in California. And within California, it is extremely rare. It occurs only in sand dune areas of a very small portion of the southern Monterey Bay. So if you look at the rank for this species, it has a California rare plant rank of 1B.2. The 1B portion corresponds to rarity, so it's considered rare or endangered in California and elsewhere. The decimal part, that .2, refers to a threat rank. In this case, it's considered moderately threatened, as a number of the occurrences occur on protected state lands. A little bit about how these ranks are determined. So CNPS and CDFW, in the form of the Natural Diversity Database, work on this process jointly. So biologists from the Native Plant Society and from the Natural Diversity Database together conduct initial research on the status of these species and propose a rank or a change in rank. If information comes to light that a species has greater threats or reduced threats or is more common or less common, these ranks can be adjusted. These ranks are then released and subject to review by the Rare Plant Review Group, which consists of over 300 botanical experts from government agencies, academia, NGOs, as well as the private sector. CDFW and CNPS operate under a memorandum of understanding that is very general in the sense that we agree to cooperate in the cause of native plant protection, and more specifically relates to we provide reciprocal and open data sharing and access as regards to rare species data. Next up are the NatureServe conservation status ranks. These are commonly referred to as global and state ranks. So NatureServe is an NGO that was formerly part of the Nature Conservancy, and it coordinates programs like mine, like the CNDDB, in all 50 states, all of the Canadian provinces, and a number of countries in Latin America. These ranks are done at both the global and state level. So across the top, you see a very simple ranking scheme going from G5, a species that would be considered globally secure, to G1 in red, which would be critically imperiled. Okay? And if you look at a species such as the marbled murrelet, this species also has state ranks or subnational ranks. So this species ranges along the Pacific coast from Alaska down to California. In the northern portion of its range, the state ranks are vulnerable, depicted in yellow. And in California, at the southern portion of its range, where populations have declined more extensively, it has a rank of S1, or imperiled in the state. So overall, it's considered globally vulnerable, but critically imperiled in California. So these global and state conservation ranks are determined by a very repeatable process that I will go through. I'm linking to a publication here, the NatureServe Conservation Status Methodology. This is available on the NatureServe website. It goes through all of the details that are used to generate these ranks, which essentially consists of estimations of current rarity, existing threats, and population trends. And who's responsible for these global and state ranks? The global ranks are determined by biologists from NatureServe, whereas the state ranks are determined by biologists from California. Now, if a species occurs only in California, then biologists from my program might be determining that global rank, since its entire rank is determined by its status here in California. Okay. So a little bit about the types of information that go into it. So in terms of rarity, we look at very standard things. Okay, rarity can consist of distribution, its geographic range. So a species such as Nuttall's scrub oak might range from San Diego up to Santa Barbara, but the area that's occupied within that range might be continuous or it might be very patchy. We'll look at the abundance, either in terms of an estimate of population size, are there 10,000 individuals or 100, or the number of occurrences. And then how many of those, something about the condition of those occurrences. How many are viable versus how many are perhaps marginal. In terms of threats, we look at the severity and scope of threats. So is is a threat both severe in its impact as well as very broad in scope. So perhaps an introduced disease that is fatal to a species and that can affect a very large portion of the population versus a threat that might be have a small impact on a population and affect only a very small portion of its range. And then in terms of trends, we look at both short-term and long-term changes in abundance. Short-term would generally be the last several generations, so perhaps 10 to 15 years, and long-term might relate to its status over the last 100 to 200 years. So I want to walk through just a couple of the steps that we would do to generate these ranks. So here we're looking at distribution. And what I have pictured here is Tidestrom's lupin. This is a rare plant that occurs from Monterey Bay up to nearby on the coast in Sonoma County. So what we do is we compile all available information on the range of the species from records in our own program, from museum data, and from any other available sources. We will map them out, shown there in the red points, and we'll use a GIS algorithm to identify the geographic range of that species. In a sense, this is here showing a range of about 2,000 kilometers. So I mentioned before, it's not just the size of the range, it's what portion is occupied. So here we're zooming in to the northern portion of the range. And what we do to determine the portion that's occupied is a repeatable method that consists of just laying a simple grid of 4 kilometer squared cells over the range, and then identifying how many of those cells are occupied by a species. In this case, it's 15 cells, which corresponds to about 3% of the range of the species. So this species has both a small range restricted to a narrow portion of the California coast, and within that range, it's not very common. And this species ends up having a rank of G1, S1. So what I'm showing here is an example of the NatureServe calculator, okay? And what we do is we plug these values into all these fields dealing with rarity, threats, and trends to create a repeatable and consistent way of generating these ranks. Now, I should mention, particularly for staff, that if there is new information available on species, one can get in touch with our program and let us know that there's new information that may come to light that might indicate a change in rarity, threats, or trends, and that we might want to look at these state ranks. And I'll just mention, it can be a little bit confusing in that most species in California have multiple statuses associated with them. Here I'm showing the burrowing owl, which is a CDFW species of special concern, and also has a global and state rank. So together these convey a more rich picture of the information on an individual species. Down at the bottom I have 2 plants, the Tidestrom's lupin, which has a rare plant rank of 1B.1 and a global and S rank of 1. Now, 90% of cases, those rare plant ranks and state ranks agree very closely. Now, the rare plant ranks separate out rarity versus threat. The threat is just that decimal point, that 0.3, whereas the state rank tries to integrate everything. So that Coast Range lomatium has a rare plant rank of 2B, which indicates it's rare or endangered in California, and a threat rank, which indicates that it has low threats. Now, this plant only has 9 known occurrences in California, so it is in California a very rare plant. But because the threats to it are low, in that it occurs in remote habitat along the north coast, the NatureServe rank, or the state rank S3, indicates that it's a vulnerable species. So together, it is very rare in California, but there's a slight discrepancy in the ranks. S3, it's indicating that it's vulnerable. 2B indicates that it is very rare, but that it has low threats. So together you get a full picture of rarity on this organism by looking at these different ranks. And with that, I will leave it to my colleague, Dr. Keeler-Wolf, to talk about communities and vegetation.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, commissioners, and staff. Thank you for allowing me to explain a relatively complex topic, and I'm going to try to do it as succinctly and as focused a way as possible. My job at the Department of Fish and Wildlife is to maintain a record of all the vegetation types in California, to foster their description and to submit this information to the public for their use and interest. And vegetation inherently is a little bit different than species. We're looking at, for example, if you would think of a flora as a list of plants of a given area, a vegetation classification is more a list of what plants do based on a naming structure that lists the most important plants with the most important roles first. So vegetation has to be thought of as a synoptic, inclusive process of many species rather than just one species at a time. The main points I want to get across in this talk are to give you a sense of how vegetation is described. We also use the term natural communities synonymously, and I'm going to do that throughout this talk just so you understand. I want to be able to tell you a little bit about the meanings and the significance of the community ranks, much like Patrick did for species. I also wanted to explain the rarity ranking process for rare natural communities or vegetation. And then I want to help explain that process using some examples from the coastal zone. So you won't be able to read this in great detail, but let me just explain that we have been doing community description and ranking through the department since the early 1980s. And that description started with anecdotal information. It became more complex and more inclusive through the mid-80s to mid-90s, and then it began to be translated to a more standardized, defensible, transparent national classification system through what we call the Manual of California Vegetation and its 2 editions. The vegetation programs in the Native Plant Society and in Department of Fish and Wildlife kind of co-evolved from listing of individual species and listing of anecdotal information about communities to focused data collection and description and mapping using scientifically rigorous process of mapping and classification. So we're at the point now in 2016 where we have about 500 alliances, which are kind of the main generic core of the descriptions, and 2,000 associations, which would be a finer level. And that distinction is similar to the difference between a genus and a species. Alliances at the genus, species at the associations. And we list all of these things to some degree of accuracy with the rare ranks that we're going to be talking more about. The other distinction that I wanted to make on this slide is that there's a distinct difference between the first 2 bullets on the left and the remaining 3 bullets on the left. And the first 2 are basically in this realm of the good old days, quote unquote, where you had ad hoc categories that made sense to many people like coastal sage scrub and maritime chaparral, for example. But they were not inclusive of all possible vegetation types. So what we ended up feeling is that we were, in many cases trying to categorize square pegs of vegetation in round holes of where they should belong. In other words, there was a mismatch. Later on, in the unhighlighted area below the pale yellow on the screen, we're moving into this quantitative defensible phase. And we changed our whole methodology where we now actually map and classify large chunks of the landscape simultaneously so that we get good information on how to define a type and good information on how to map every single type that's within a project area. So vegetation used to be classified from the standpoint of a functional but anecdotal approach. Now it's based on a quantitatively driven approach with a hierarchy that relates very much like a hierarchy in any taxonomy does, exclusive kind of nested relationships within different categories. And that sort of leads to this notion of measurable differences in species composition, in structure, and in the very landscape conditions and environments that are important to define these various levels of classification, and components of rarity that go along with them. When we talk about rarity ranking in California, we're talking about the alliance level and the association level. So we're basically ranking the alliance and then the associations that are nested within that alliance. Here's an example. All of you probably know coast live oak woodlands from being coastal dwellers in California. On the right, you have a range map of the general extent of all coast live oak woodlands at that alliance level, that generic level. And then the arrows and the individual photos on the left point to individual plant associations of that coast live oak alliance. Depending on the environment, the geographic location, and environmental variables, you may have coast live oak over poison oak. We may have coast live oak in an open woodland over grasses. We may have more dense coast live oak with other trees like madrones in moister areas. And in Southern California, for example, in riparian areas, you have coast live oak mixing with willows and sycamores. So those are just 4 examples of association level differences within that broader umbrella of the alliance. And each of these associations has its own distribution and rarity characteristics. So I want to read this through with you, and then we'll get to the definition of these highlighted blue words on the left. Each vegetation unit is defined and described by sampling a group of stands with a common growth form and a constant set of diagnostic species, including characteristic species of the dominant growth form, sharing a similar set of regional, environmental, and disturbance factors. So that's a general description of what a vegetation community is. Now, I feel that I need to explain what some of these loaded words are. So a stand is the fundamental unit of vegetation classification. In order to have a stand of vegetation, you must have homogeneous plant species composition and structure. So if you look at that photograph with the delineations on the right, you'll see we have at the top of that ridge near the sky a scrubby vegetation that we call chaparral. It has a very different species composition and a very different structure than the oak woodland down the hill from it, and that in turn has a very different species composition and structure from the coastal sage scrub down near the bottom of the hill, and that in turn has a very different species composition and structure from the savanna woodland down in that open valley. So those are just some examples of how we think about delineating stands, which are the core units of description for vegetation classification. The term dominant or dominance that we used in that first definition simply means species with the highest percent cover. Usually it's in the uppermost layer. If you look at this forest, for example, of bishop pines on the north coast, you'll see a grassy understory and that dark overstory of bishop pines. Bishop pines are the dominant in that particular stand of vegetation. They have the most weight. They influence the understory of grasses based on their shading, and therefore, in many respects, they are physically and environmentally dominant. Constancy is another term that we use, or constant species. That little chart on the right with the highlighted column in yellow identifies this term constancy, labeled as con in that little table, as a very important descriptor of vegetation. Constancy is essentially just the fact that species occur in different frequencies in these stands that are compared and found to be similar, and that value of constancy in this one is 100% for the lemonade berry called Rhus integrifolia, the top one on that highlighted list, but it varies in different species going on down that list to the bottom. And constancy becomes a very important feature and in many cases more important than dominance when we do classification. Now, a diagnostic species kind of comes out of that notion of constancy. So a diagnostic species is any species or a group of species whose relative constancy or abundance differentiates one vegetation type from another. So I'm going to sink to an all-time low and use a sports analogy, which I never do. But the sports analogy is, if you were to think of the Golden State Warriors as, hooray, thank you, I feel the same way, as a vegetation type, you would think of Steph Curry as the diagnostic species. That makes sense to you. So how we get those
We
diagnostic
certainly recognize their
species.
dominance. Thank you.
Yeah, there's that as well. But he's not the biggest. He's just, you know, what would the, anyway, we won't go any further. I'll wax poetic later. So the way that we get to these diagnostic species labels, in other words, the way we name different vegetation associations is using multivariate statistics like this cluster analysis that you see that looks like a dendrogram or a family tree on the left. And basically what this does is it compares the similarity of all of these different sample plots that are involved in a classification exercise and groups them based on diagnostic species. So each one of those solid little rectangles would be defined by a diagnostic species or a group of diagnostic species if they were to be considered a plant association. And those things have that diagnostic species that are singular or limited in large part to one vegetation type. And they also have corresponding environmental variables that can be teased out in analyses that we call ordination. So there's this sort of scientific process behind all of this. And what this gets us is these interesting possible variations, particularly in vegetation where individual plants like trees aren't around for a long time. And we think of grasslands or wildflower fields as good examples of this. So our state grass, the purple needlegrass, is a constant, but not always the dominant in certain stands that are called purple needlegrass alliance or purple needlegrass associations. So here's one of these summary tables of a bunch of individual sampled stands, and those top two species are the constant and diagnostic. They have 100% representation in all of the sample plots, but they may not have as high a cover as some of the other species that are listed in pink below that. But if you look at the constancy value, those ones below that have lower constancy. So we throw all of that definition material into the mix when we look at the definition of individual vegetation types to be ranked for rarity. Now that center box that says guidelines for rarity ranks is the formula for many, many years we used. We have these global and state ranks, much as Patrick described already. We have general kind of rules of thumb. You know, to be a G1, S1, or an S1, you have to have fewer than 6 viable occurrences and generally less than about 1,500 acres in total of occupancy of the landscape and so forth. But what's happened, obviously, over the years with greater need for quantification and for transparency in our methodologies for all scientists that do interface with public information and with conservation activities, we are becoming more and more quantifiable, transparent, repeatable, and therefore, much as Patrick described in his presentation, we have these different categories that we now can put more distinctive metrics on. Rarity, the range and extent of the component of rarity versus the number of acres of area occupied versus the number of individual sites or stands of different vegetation types and so forth. And the same with threats, and you can see that we have, you know, sort of a lexicon or a glossary of what different levels of threats are and so forth. So I don't want to go into a lot of time about how to run through these, but I'd be happy to explain it further if anyone is interested. Suffice it to say that rarity ranking is more robust, more defensible, and transparent now than it was when I started this kind of work 20 or 25 years ago. And a lot of this has to do with this rarity rank calculation procedure that the NatureServe organization has kind of dispensed and fine-tuned with all of our cooperating natural heritage network states. All of the United States have programs like Patrick and mine to one degree and another. We all speak the same language when it comes to rarity. So we also have this pressure valve where if you don't have all these data and you don't have perfect maps and perfect occurrence records of every single identified type of vegetation, you can resort to more general calculation means, much like Patrick showed in his little grid cell analysis in his presentation. So we can think about number of occurrences and area of occupancy based on, you know, what does this vegetation type really need and how much of that geologic substrate or that soil type are there on the landscape to choose from, for example. So this is a way, I'm just going to run through a couple of exercises here to show how we establish the rarity of a vegetation type. So the way we do business now is that we actually map wall-to-wall in project areas. Many of them are large natural areas like the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, and many of them are mapped with financial assistance from other organizations, like in this case the National Park Service. But basically what this enables us to do is, if you zoom in, looking at that little box on the previous slide to a larger view of it, every single vegetation polygon, it's difficult to see in the image, but there's a lot of little yellow patches that are delineated, and each one of those is a different type. Then we find out what those are called. We can label the ones that have those rarity ranks of S3, S2, S1, for example, and know exactly where they occur, as opposed to the old days where we basically had to go out on our own looking for what we thought were rare communities without any sort of standardized methodology. And if we happen to come across one, we'd jot it down, make a map of it, and throw it into our National Diversity database. So this is a much more efficient and inclusive and thorough way of doing mapping and inventorying. We've done this over about 50% of the state now. That diagram on the left shows our completed or active mapping areas where we've done classification work. There's about 85 of them now. We have a lot more to go. And you can also see, if you take a quick look, that certainly the coast is not overrepresented by this work. In fact, if anything, it's underrepresented, unfortunately. So I'm going to give you an example from an area that we know quite well. That's the South Coast, basically from Point Conception down to Tijuana. And this is a definition of a vegetation type that was defined from that Santa Monica Mountains project. There's 48 samples of it. We have descriptions of it. We have a table summarizing the vegetation data and so forth. And based on that, we also have a rarity rank that came out of this one project that told us that we thought it would be a G3, S3 with a question mark, meaning we don't have the full extent and information needed to make a positive determination. But it's definitely one of the rarer of the many vegetation types in California. This is a coastal sage scrub member, a particular endemic type only found in this part of south coastal California. And when we take it to the broader level, how much outside of this one study project would be likely to be expected to give us that kind of global rank, we look at things like the Consortium for California Herbaria, which have plant species record for the diagnostic species Eriogonum cinereum or ashy buckwheat. And here's where it is. It's mostly in that LA Basin coastal area, but it ranges close to Point Conception on the north and down into central San Diego County with a few records kind of far afield there. We think about, well, what would, if we had a map of it, what would it look like of the whole entire range? And we obviously have to consider what can be occupied, and much of South Coastal California looks like these images. Virtually no place for natural vegetation to grow more than just in a few acres or a few square yards in size. And then we come up with a map like this, which depicts the general range of what we think this vegetation type to be. We modify that when we think about rarity. We have 350 individual little occurrences in the map from the Santa Monicas. They range from a third of an acre to almost 37 acres in size. There's about 1,000 of those that we have mapped. And we also estimate that about 2/3 of this whole range has not been inventoried as of the time of our first ranking. So with that level of confidence in those numbers, we came up with this G3, S3 with the question marks as a first order of magnitude guesstimation, really, of how much there was, how rare it was. Then we had more data coming in, and the more data gave us much more information. Mapping continued down through the Palos Verdes Peninsula, well into Orange County, San Diego County, and elsewhere over the past several years since that description was written. And we have an ability to update that rarity. So what we found from the Palos Verdes Peninsula and from the other sites south is that if they existed at all, the stands of Ashew buckwheat were small and compromised by development, by invasive weeds like fountain grass that tend to come up on the same kind of steep slopes and crowd out the buckwheat, changing the composition to non-native fountain grass stands instead. And therefore, almost all of the stands that exist outside of much of the Santa Monica Mountains protected area are fragmented and threatened by different types of threats. So therefore, we now can refine that distribution and rarity information, and we have knowledge from the central two blobs that you might be able to see in that image, and then those two question marks are where our knowledge is still lacking. So we're not there to complete understanding, but we're getting close. And our current ranking for this type is G2 S2.2, rarer and more threatened with definite threats based on what we found out about this particular vegetation type. I want to go through a couple of other examples that might be illustrative of things that might be on your minds or cooperating consultants or staff members. We're looking at, in this case, another one of these stand tables of the purple needlegrass association on the south coast, and this data comes from Orange County, where we had 19 samples. And you can't see the details, but I've outlined them on the bullet points here. Those diagnostic Steph Curry type species only range from 2 to 25% cover. And that's in contrast with some of the other less constant, but sometimes more abundant species, such as red brome, or various kinds of star thistle, or false brome, and some of these other non-native grasses or forbs that tend to swamp out all vegetation types to one degree or another in the coast areas. So what I'm getting at here is that our non-native plant relative cover proportion is 64%. So almost 2/3 of all the species in this vegetation are really not native to California. But this is what we've got to work with. And this is why we rank based on existing information to this day with the best of all our knowledge, as opposed to what we think sort of that primeval vision, which is always going to be impossible to really see, might be. So this is the norm for the community. Needlegrass grasslands do have non-natives in them, sometimes more than you might like or more than you might think. And we have bounds on how much we should allow non-native proportion based on the sample data and the analyses that we've done. So here, for example, is a key, an identification guide to the needlegrass grasslands, in this case of Sonoma County. Again, we talk about the terms dominated or characterized, and we say that native grasses and forbs usually make up greater than 10% cover of the herbaceous layer. That's relative to the total cover of herbaceous layer. 10% of the entire herbaceous layer is made up of natives, which really isn't a lot. That means up to 90% of the entire cover might be non-natives. And the reason that we can say this is that the analysis tell us that all those non-natives that may be higher cover are highly variable from plot to plot, and they are not considered diagnostic because they're not ubiquitous in the samples. So ubiquity and constancy, again, come up very importantly in these definitions. Now, what's the threshold between native and non-native, you might ask? And we do have a huge category of non-native vegetation types, and this is, again, sort of part of the key of vegetation to a study we did in Sonoma County. Herbaceous vegetation strongly dominated by non-native grasses and forbs falls into this category that nests within it have many different alliances and associations, and it's called Mediterranean California naturalized annual and perennial grassland. And native herbaceous species have insignificant cover in these stands, especially during the active growing season. In other words, to really be sure what you're looking at, you got to go there when these herbaceous plants are visible. They're not dead or skeletons or seeds under the ground that you can't see. Here's just a little bit about how we map and how confident we feel about mapping things, for example, like grasslands. Here we have Orange County, the open space areas of Orange County, with the green being this purple needlegrass grassland and the brown being foothill needlegrass grassland, two different types of needlegrass grasslands. You can see that 3-mile distance roughly indicating the coastal zone, and you don't see very many even little green or brown dots in that blob of yellow in the coastal zone. And that's an interesting point. There are stands of needlegrass grassland in the coastal zone, but we cover large areas. By necessity, we have to map relatively large chunks. In other words, an acre or more of grassland that is called a particular type. It's usually the minimum map unit, that MMU that's in that list on the right. And therefore, small stands do not get counted or inventoried. And Jana, I think, will talk a little bit about the sort of philosophy about how that can be taken into context at a finer level of resolution. But what I do want to show you is that these are accurately mapped. For every map we do, we have an accuracy assessment that's statistically sound, and we have 94% accuracy for one type and 93% accuracy for the other, which is an A. And therefore, we feel pretty confident that what we do map, we map well, and they're very descriptive. Say, one more little story here. This is the Dr. Seuss plant of coastal California. It's the giant Coreopsis, and it's most common out on the Channel Islands. But there is one particular association that you can find in the coast of Southern California, and that is best described and detailed from the Santa Monica Mountains. So here's what we can do to actually look at individual occurrences. Each one of those arrows points to one of the 27 occurrences of this Coreopsis, sagebrush, ashy buckwheat plant association. And the largest one is about 34 acres, and the smallest one is very small, about less than a half an acre. And yet, the size alone is not the only area of interest in terms of how we would rank it. We look at these individual stands, and we see actually the largest stand in this whole lexicon of types is somewhat disturbed. You see the non-native ice plant growing in there on the left, and you see the houses and the road adjacent to the stand, and that's part of the largest stand. And one of the smaller but better stands in terms of site quality with natives predominant and no immediate threats of development or incursion of any sort of weedy invasion is on the right, and it's smaller. So small stands, as long as they contain everything that defines that vegetation type, can be thought of as better in quality and in viability than some large stands. Important point. Okay, last story. This is another way of looking at rare plant communities. Many of you have probably heard or even heard in hearings about Mendocino pygmy forest up on the Mendocino coast of the White Plains, and these little dwarf trees that grow there. For years, we thought of them as a member of one vegetation alliance, the Pygmy Cypress Alliance. But in reality, there's many things going on up there. And so we actually launched a project last year to sample the entire environment that contains pygmy ecosystem, as we called it. And this is actually revised and gotten much more accuracy on what's really happening. We've looked at many, many samples throughout this range, and we've basically determined that we have 3 different plant associations that are part of this Pygmy Cypress Alliance. Each one of them at least a G2 S2.1. In other words, every single of those 3 has high threats and relatively low numbers and viability and sizes. In addition, there's 3 more vegetation types that are not defined as Pygmy Cypress that are associated within these what we call oligotrophic, which just means lousy soil situations. And so we're learning a lot by looking at focused vegetation analyses as well as by these broad project level vegetation analyses. So I just want to close by, in summary, saying that vegetation ranking is similar to rare species ranking, similar to the way Patrick presented his points. It's best done using quantitative definitions and range-wide vegetation mapping, of which we are not all the way there, but we're working as quickly and as hopefully as we can to get full statewide understanding. Our information is found on our websites. I'm assuming this presentation will be made public record, and you can look at these links. So we have a list of the rare natural communities that's updated periodically. We have our sort of standards and methodology that's up on our website. The Native Plant Society has a website that displays all of the alliance level definitions that are found in the Manual of California Vegetation. That's very handy to look at. And similar to what Patrick said, the underpinnings of all of the methodology involved here are found in NatureServe papers that are also found at those bottom websites. Above all, I want to emphasize that we are not up to date where we're really behind on ranking some of these rare natural communities. Our process involves kind of ecoregion by ecoregion stepping. And we're currently working on the South Coast, which is useful for many of the projects that you review, but we won't be on the North Coast re-ranking vegetation until we have much better vegetation data in many cases, so that may be a few years away. In the meantime, call us. Call Diana Hickson or myself. We're the 2 leads of the program, and we may indeed have ranks that just aren't published yet, that may have just been completed in an analysis, and we would happily walk you through any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick and Todd. It is a true privilege, and we are really lucky at the Coastal Commission to be able to work with Patrick and Todd. Can you guys hear me? Hey, Billy, I'm going to need you.
I heard that.
So you're going to have to bring my slideshow up.
Okay.
But again, just so that everyone hears, I feel that it is a real privilege and that the commission staff is lucky to have Patrick and Todd to for their expert opinion and to tap into their expertise. I've had the privilege of working with Todd since I started here when it was difficult to tell what is maritime chaparral, and so he was wonderful in helping me to become more of an expert on that. So good morning, commissioners. As the commission's ecologist, Dr. Dixon, Dr. Coteen, Dr. Garsky, Garcia, and I are responsible for making environmentally sensitive habitat or ESHA determinations. The purpose of my presentation is to give you an overview of what is often a technically complex analysis, to discuss how we go about identifying and delineating ESHA and determining rarity, some considerations of ESHA determinations and ESHA buffers. But first, I want to briefly talk about rarity in California. I show you this map because it highlights the importance of the Commission's mission to protect and enhance California's coast and ocean natural resources for present and future generations. This 2013 NatureServe map of the United States shows areas with the highest numbers of rare species in red, which are the locations NatureServe describes as essentially irreplaceable and that present important conservation priorities. You can see that some of the greatest biological richness and rarest species are located along the California coast, many of which are located within or near highly urbanized areas where development pressure can be greatest. Two backbone components of ESHA determinations are identifying and confirming that rare habitat or habitat that supports rare plants or animals occurs on a site, and delineating or mapping the ESHA. ESHA determinations typically require detailed research and time on site. Coastal analysts make the initial call about the need for biological review when new applications are submitted. Analysts typically know the landscape in their region and where biological resources are likely to occur, as well as the standard of review that will be applied and the respective ESHA policies and associated ESHA map. A critical step for project applications involving biological resources is to decide if they have all the necessary information for a thorough review, which requires a comprehensive biology report no older than 5 years, or final CEQA or NEPA documents, and protocol-level surveys if the site potentially supports listed animal species. Staff ecologists make use of the best available science and consult an array of resources in addition to project biology reports, including wonderful resources like Todd and Patrick. We typically receive biology reports that have used the Holland Vegetation Classification System, or more recently, the second edition of the Manual of California Vegetation that was updated in 2009 based on NatureServe's National Vegetation Classification System, and that is colloquially referred to as MCV2. Here is an example of a site in Carpinteria, just above Rincon, where the vegetation has been mapped based on Holland, with 4 broad vegetation types shown in different colors. And here is the same site in Carpinteria mapped using MCV2, showing 15 different alliances in colors with their rarity rankings identified in the legend. To accurately identify vegetation communities, biologists employ quantitative field methods such as transects or quadrats or visual estimates of cover in particular homogeneous areas. Biological reports should include a site map with vegetation polygons. We identify rarity based on the determinations made by the resource agencies as discussed by Patrick and Todd or by other expert groups. Now I'll discuss the process involved in delineating rare vegetation communities using a few examples. Before we conduct site visits, we have analyzed the biology on the site and are ready to ground check our research and verify or not on-the-ground conditions with project biology report findings. We consider every site on a case-by-case basis and keep in mind that there may be spatial and temporal and physical and biological nuances and idiosyncrasies, as well as potential natural and anthropogenic disturbance that must be considered when evaluating the adequacy of vegetation mapping and making an ESHA determination. Coastal dunes are rare habitats that consist of sand hummocks and ridges characterized by a small number of native plants and animals adapted to harsh conditions. Dune habitats are extremely dynamic and shift naturally from vegetated to unvegetated based on moving sand associated with seasonal patterns and storms. MCV2 describes coastal dune vegetation as stands of perennial plants adapted to sand and salt spray along the Pacific coast on bluffs and beaches with less than 10% cover. Because of their dynamic nature, dunes are especially vulnerable to non-native species, which tend to be opportunistic and adept colonizers of bare or disturbed habitat. Most dune systems in California are invaded by non-natives to one degree or another. In several instances, the Commission has found dunes dominated by non-native plants to be ESHA. Holland describes just 4 broad types of coastal sage scrub, while MCV2 describes hundreds of scrub alliances and associations. The Encilia californica Shrubland Alliance, also called California Brittle Bush Shrubland, shown here, is a rare type of coastal sage scrub only found in limited areas along the coast of Southern California. The MCV2 membership rule for this alliance is that it supports 30% cover or more of Encilia californica. If the percent cover of this Encilia is less than 30% relative cover, it does not meet the membership rule for this alliance. It is important to point out that this and most other vegetation communities along the coast are invaded by non-native and invasive species to one degree or another. We look at each site individually and consider many factors, but in all cases, the threshold for invaded rare habitats not to rise to the level of ESHA is high. In analysis of multiple samples in a variety of areas, as Todd explained, the presence of purple needlegrass as a regular member of a grassland stand is the most important criterion. Thus, purple needlegrass is an indicator of the purple needlegrass grassland, and it is less important to have very high dominance by purple needlegrass. This is why the MCV2 membership rule requires only 10% or greater relative cover. Thus, purple needlegrass grassland may be dominated by European annual grasses and still meet the definition of ESHA. This slide is a photo of Moore Mesa in Santa Barbara, which is a coastal mesa that supports a complex of vernal pools. Vernal pool is a term of art that refers to a particular type of seasonal wetland with habitat characteristics that present severe physiological constraints resulting in unique and often rare endemic species of plants and animals. These pools tend to occur in aggregations, often in a landscape of more or less uniformly arrayed low hummocks and swales. Vernal pools were once common on coastal terraces in Southern California, but are now very rare due to development, and we consider these seasonal wetlands to be ESHA. ESHA can consist of habitat that supports a population of rare plants or habitat that is especially valuable because it supports rare animals. Annual plants complete their life cycle from germination to the production of seed within 1 year and then die. Therefore, a significant part of the population is the seeds in the soil or the seed bank. Emergent plants are mercurial due to temporal changes in the environment, and surveying for the seed bank is rarely done. So to determine the accurate limit of the spatial extent of a rare annual plant population requires sampling for several years. Perennial plants live longer than 1 year and have specific blooming times when they should be surveyed because this is when they are easy to identify. Yaden's rain orchid is a perennial plant that is imperiled and seriously endangered in California. It typically blooms between May and August and is found in coastal bluff scrub, maritime chaparral, and closed-cone pine forest in a very, very small part of California on the coast. At Pebble Beach on the Monterey Peninsula, the Commission found that Yaden's rain orchid, shown in purple within Monterey pine forest, was ESHA. The next few slides are examples of the different ways we delineate rare animal habitat. Smith's blue butterfly occurs in Southern California along coastal bluffs and requires the buckwheat plants, as John told you earlier, Eriogonum parvifolium and Eriogonum latifolium. The way we delineate the butterfly ESHA is by mapping the host plants because of the tight association of the butterfly and the buckwheat. And again, we look at each case on a case-by-case basis. Distinctive dwellings are indicative of the presence of certain species of animals, including wood rats. Wood rats, such as the rare San Francisco dusky wood rat shown here, and the San Diego wood rats build stick houses that we use to determine the ESHA boundary. The California gnatcatcher is another example of a rare species with distinctive habitat requirements. It is dependent on coastal sage scrub with a dominance of coastal sage bush, California buckwheat, or Encilia. The Commission has found that appropriate habitat within the gnatcatcher's range is ESHA due to its important ecosystem function for supporting a rare species. The Commission has found that native or non-native tree stands that support listed raptors are ESHA. The Commission has also found that tree stands documented to support a suite of different raptor species over the years are ESHA. Now, most ESHA is disturbed to a greater or lesser degree. It is very rare to find pristine habitat that does not have a history of natural or anthropogenic disturbance. Natural disturbance includes fire, floods, and storms. Anthropogenic disturbance, such as urban development and agriculture, in addition to direct disturbance, includes fire, introduction of non-native species, pollution, and many other associated disturbances. For example, at Marblehead, much of the habitat was invaded by non-native species. In this slide, you can see residual stands of coastal sage scrub among non-native weeds. Although the area was very disturbed, gnatcatchers occupied the site, and the Commission found the disturbed coastal sage scrub to be ESHA. Where disturbance results from unpermitted development, we consider what the site supported in the absence of the unpermitted development to be the on-the-ground conditions. As you can see in this slide of the photos of before mowing ended and after mowing stopped, habitat can be very resilient. What is a buffer? The dictionary definition of buffer is one that lessens, absorbs, or protects against the shock of an impact, to deaden the shock of. A buffer, in the context of the Commission, is a barrier, safe zone, or bordering strip of natural habitat or land between ESHA and development or human disturbance. Buffer, buffer zone, and setback are used interchangeably by the Commission, and all three terms are found in LCPs. The purpose of a buffer is to enable natural communities to go about their business as usual. In addition to buffering against a whole host of potential natural and anthropogenic disturbance types, buffers are also a mechanism for accounting for uncertainty in determining the boundary. One of my first assignments at the Commission was to review the scientific literature on buffers and the buffer and mitigation ratio policies in LCPs across the state. Across the board, the scientific literature cites greater distances for buffering rare vegetation communities and individual plants and animals from disturbance compared to the Commission's policies. The pattern I found was that older LCPs had very dated buffer requirements and no mitigation ratio policies, and that recently certified or updated LCPs had more scientifically defensible buffer requirements, and they did have mitigation ratio policies. When making buffer recommendations, we consider each site and ESHA type individually and consider a number of issues shown on this slide. In past actions, the Commission has often found that buffers of 50 to 150 feet in width are adequately protective, depending on the habitat or species being protected. Thank you, and now I'll turn my presentation over to Aaron.
Good morning. So as you heard, I'm Aaron Chalmers, Staff Counsel with the Commission, and my presentation will briefly describe the legal context in which ESHA is regulated under the Coastal Act. So the Coastal Act contains strong protections for ESHA, and Section 30240 is the primary provision governing the regulation of ESHA. Notably, the provision does not simply encourage protection of ESHA, but states that ESHA shall be protected against any significant disruption of habitat values. Further, it only allows resource-dependent uses in the ESHA. In addition, as you've already heard, the provision requires that development adjacent to ESHA is also restricted to the extent necessary to protect the ESHA. And my presentation will address two main points. First, what are the legal principles governing the designation of ESHA in the first place? And second, what are the consequences of that designation once it has been made? In terms of designation of ESHA, the first issue is who decides what areas constitute ESHA. If there is no certified LCP, the Commission makes this determination, generally in the context of permit applications. The Commission also has a role in reviewing jurisdictions' ESHA designations when LCPs are proposed and when LCP certification comes before the Commission. In areas with certified LCPs, the LCP designations and policies generally control. However, even here, the Commission may play a role because some LCPs do not precisely map ESHA. In fact, some of them leave the final ESHA designation to a case-by-case determination through project review. And so in those cases, the Commission, if the Commission gets an appeal of a particular permit, it may have a chance to review those ESHA determinations. If an LCP's ESHA policies are subject to more than one interpretation, courts have held that the Commission should interpret them to conform with Section 30240 and its protections. However, if an LCP has very clear and precise definitions of what is and what is not ESHA, then those determinations are binding on the Commission. And I would also note that ESHA policies in an LCP may be more protective than what is required by the Coastal Act, but may not be less protective. Whether it's the Commission or a local jurisdiction that designates ESHA, that decision must be based on substantial evidence in the record. For example, such evidence could consist of Commission staff biologist reports, site visits by Commission staff to confirm the habitat status or species, evidence of the species on the site, reports of outside biologists or experts, or inclusion of a species or habitat area on a list of imperiled species or important habitat. And you've heard about some of those such lists today. Under this substantial evidence standard, courts will uphold the Commission's ESHA determination if it is supported by substantial evidence, even if the Commission could have made a different decision based on that evidence. And under this standard, a disagreement between, for example, an applicant's biologist and the Commission's biologist does not negate the Commission's evidence, and the Commission is still entitled to rely on its own biologist and its own evidence. Now, of course, speculation or unsubstantiated opinions do not constitute substantial evidence. Rather, substantial evidence consists of facts and reasonable assumptions based on those facts. Now, substantial evidence must support both the designation of ESHA as well as the decision to not designate ESHA. And I think that's an important point. In one published case, the court overturned the Commission's decision to not designate pygmy forest areas of Mendocino County as ESHA, finding that in that case the decision was not supported by substantial evidence. As you've heard from some other speakers already today, ESHA is defined as an area where plant or animal life is rare or especially valuable. It's important to note, as others have already today, that an area can be ESHA based on its important value for a species, even if there is not documented recent use of that area by individuals of the species. And the case McAllister versus Coastal Commission is instructive on this point. There, an applicant wished to develop a coastal lot, and the lot contains hundreds of buckwheat plants, which, as you've heard, was very important for the endangered Smith's blue butterfly. However, even though the site was in the middle of the butterfly's coastal range, no butterflies had actually been seen during recent site visits. Because the record contained evidence that the buckwheat plants were very important for the endangered butterfly, and the site was actually in the middle of the butterfly's known range, the court upheld the Commission's determination that the project area contained ESHA, despite the fact that actual butterflies had not recently been seen on the site. The McAllister case also illustrates a second important point, that degraded habitat can still qualify as ESHA. In that case, development was proposed in an area that was generally within coastal bluff scrub habitat, although the proposed building envelope itself did not have any such vegetation because it had previously been cleared and colonized by invasive plants. The court upheld the Commission's determination that the site was ESHA despite the lack of bluff scrub vegetation in one particular area. And the court described how ruling otherwise would encourage the covert destruction of developmentally desirable areas in important habitat. And I would note that this ruling is consistent with other case law and with the Commission's practice, as you've heard before, of disregarding unpermitted development when making ESHA determinations. In other words, the Commission generally determines whether or not an area is ESHA, generally determines that based on existing conditions. However, if there's a history of unpermitted or otherwise unlawful development, it disregards that and attempts to figure out what was there before that unpermitted development occurred. In another case, the City of Chula Vista versus Superior Court case, that court upheld the Commission's determination that a degraded upland area in the City of Chula Vista was ESHA. Even though the area was dominated by weedy plants and animals associated with disturbed habitat, the evidence demonstrated that the area was still ESHA because the upland was adjacent to a highly functioning marsh, provided important feeding grounds for the marsh species, and was essential for maintaining the surrounding marsh complex. Courts have also identified a few other relevant factors in designating ESHA. First, a habitat's rarity may support its designation as ESHA. For example, the fact that a particular type of habitat, such as wetlands or pygmy forest, has been extensively disturbed or developed or destroyed in the past makes it especially vital to protect the remaining areas of habitat, and even if they are degraded. Second, important habitat areas need not be unique to the coastal zone. Rather, they may be ESHA if they are rare or valuable within the coastal zone, even if they extend outside of the coastal zone. And finally, habitat can be ESHA even if it has non-native species, or in some cases, even if it is dominated by non-native species. And one example of this, which again we've heard a little bit about today already, is that stands of eucalyptus groves, for example, in some cases may provide important roosting and nesting habitat for birds of prey. So next I'll address what happens once ESHA has been designated. Once designated, ESHA is protected through three primary restrictions on development. First, only uses that are dependent on that ESHA resource may be located in the area. Second, there's not allowed to be any significant disruption of the habitat values. And third, there are limits on development around ESHA. Neither the Coastal Act nor the Commission's regulations define resource-dependent uses. However, the Commission has previously identified nature trails, research or educational activities, restoration work, low-impact camping, and wildlife management activities as types of resource-dependent activities. And courts have emphatically rejected attempts to portray residential development as resource-dependent. For instance, in the McAllister case that I discussed a moment ago, the applicant had argued that the residential development project included mitigation measures such as removing buckwheat plants and replanting them elsewhere. And the applicant characterized that as restoration, which is an allowed use of ESHA. The court strongly disagreed, holding that the purpose of the project, in fact, was residential development, not restoration, and that, and I'll quote from the court here, the fact that the project includes enhancement and restoration measures does not convert its residential purpose into a resource-dependent use. The case Bolsa Chica Land Trust versus Superior Court illustrates important principles governing the second prong of 30240 regarding disruption of habitat values. There, the Commission had approved an LCP that allowed destruction of 5 acres of degraded eucalyptus that had been designated and was designated as ESHA in the relevant LCP. The Commission reasoned that destruction of this ESHA was allowed because the habitat value of the grove would be recreated elsewhere through mitigation. The Court overturned the Commission's decision, emphasizing that the Coastal Act does not permit destruction of ESHA in one area merely because its habitat values will be recreated elsewhere. Rather, the Coastal Act protects the actual area of the ESHA. The Court also held that the degraded status of the eucalyptus in that case did not justify giving it lesser protection. Rather, because it was designated as ESHA in the LCP, its degraded status was irrelevant. As the Court described, once ESHA is designated, they receive uniform protection regardless of their present viability. Section 30240 does not prohibit all disruption of ESHA, though. Rather, it only disallows significant disruption, and in some cases, minor disruption. For example, removal of a few plants in part of an overall habitat area may not rise to the level of significant disruption and may be allowed so long as it is for a resource-dependent use. And as always, this determination would be made, of course, only after a thorough investigation of the facts. In addition to restricting development in ESHA, the law also restricts development around ESHA. Development adjacent to ESHA need not be resource-dependent. However, it must be designed to ensure that ESHA is not significantly degraded. To carry out this mandate, the Commission and LCPs generally require buffer zones around ESHA where only limited development is allowed. And again, as you've heard today, some LCPs tend to designate specific mandatory minimum buffer zones, and others leave it up to a case-by-case determination based on the facts. Now, there are a few circumstances in which development in ESHA may be allowed, notwithstanding the otherwise applicable restrictions. And Chris Peterson had spoken to these exceptions a little bit yesterday in the context of wetlands. And I'll describe them in a little more detail, but they're equally applicable to ESHA. First, occasionally, ESHA protections may conflict with other important Coastal Act policies, in which case the Commission may resolve the conflict in a manner that overall is the most protective of significant coastal resources. However, courts have repeatedly rejected attempts to use this balancing approach to allow residential development in ESHA in cases where it was merely more convenient and not truly necessary to have that development in order to carry out other Coastal Act policies. And second, the Commission may limit application of ESHA protections to the extent necessary to avoid an unconstitutional taking of private property. Thus, in rare cases, limited development of ESHA may be allowed in order to provide a landowner with a reasonable economic use of her land. However, this so-called takings override provision is only appropriate when deciding what development may be allowed in an ESHA, and courts have described how it is not appropriate to consider this factor when deciding whether to designate ESHA in the first place. So to wrap up, I'll just leave you with some of the main take-home points. First, determining whether habitat qualifies as ESHA is a fact-intensive inquiry, as I'm sure you've learned from the detailed presentations today. And an area that may qualify as ESHA, or rather an area may qualify as ESHA, even if a layperson, such as myself, may not think that it looks or feels like ESHA. Additionally, all ESHA receives uniform protection from development once it's designated, and it receives protection both in and around it, and its destruction may not be justified by mitigating those impacts elsewhere. And finally, courts have vigorously enforced the Coastal Act's ESHA protections, repeatedly rejecting creative arguments that would allow ESHA destruction in order to permit non-resource dependent development. And with that will wrap up staff's presentation, and I believe we have time for questions.
Thank you. Do we apply for our degree at the end of this session, or do we have to take an open book test? It's going to need to be open book for me. Impressive, for sure. Certainly, I'm sure it leads to a number of questions and comments from commissioners and perhaps the public as well. I only have one speaker card, and I think I'll take that. If there are others, please bring them over. Otherwise, I'll call up Don Schmitz.
Morning, Commissioners. Don Schmitz. Indeed, an impressive presentation, and the science as laid out by very impressive people is incontrovertible. It's also 99% of the time beside the point. Let me tell you the reality of what we're dealing with out there since 2002. And remember, you've been in existence for 4 decades. So for 3/4 of the history of the Coastal Commission, the ESHA policies were not applied the way they are today. Do you know what's ESHA? Everything. Everything that has not been legally developed that represents an unbroken block of native vegetation, and Dr. Dixon wrote a very impressive memo in regards to this, is ESHA, and sometimes, as you heard, non-native vegetation. 30240 of the Coastal Act says especially rare unique animal species, and the courts have absolutely said you can't develop anything in that at all. Now, up until 2002, when this commission adopted the local coastal program for the city of Malibu, about 1%, for instance, of the Santa Monica Mountains was considered ESHA, that was the bottom of the creeks. Staff had unilateral authority, and the commission on a 7-5 vote adopted that LCP that said any unbroken swath of vegetation is ESHA. Even if there's nothing rare or unique in regards to plants or animal species which are there. And if you take a look at the staff reports, the justification for that is that there's 4 places globally that has this chaparral on it: California, South Africa, the Mediterranean, and Southeast Australia. So on a global scale, which I don't believe is what the California legislature wrote, but on a global scale, only 6% of the world's biome is this type of chaparral. And so even though the vegetation we're talking about in places like the Santa Monica Mountains is one of the most common, if not the most common biome in the state and in public ownership, it's treated as ESHA. Now, you as the commission have the ability to protect that resource. Nobody is saying, ESHA or otherwise, that it shouldn't be protected. You can call it a sensitive resource area like you did for 3 out of the 4 decades of your existence. But it is true that the courts, actually in the Bolsa Chica case, it was the commission that was getting sued for allowing the removal of a dying eucalyptus grove that they had designated as ESHA. Once you call it ESHA, I'll give you a real world example. I've talked to cities, I've talked to clients that have 100, 200 acres with existing pads and roads on them. They want to put in a visitor serving commercial use with little cabins and such. They can't do it. They have to do a house because that's the only legal thing that the commission will allow, because if they don't, under the Lucas case, it's considered a taking. There are huge unintended consequences from this.
Thank you. We'll bring it back here to commissioners. Do commissioners have questions, comments, beginning with Commissioner McClure, then Commissioner Howell?
Thank you. Yeah, I have comments because I'm probably a little more confused than I was confused before, because I have a problem with understanding the ESHA designation, and I realize that we have won many times in court, and I wish that we would have had a little more balanced report that discovered the times that we've lost in court. You know, because here we have the SNG project, for instance, where it's a beautiful sand dune with all sorts of species and plants that are very sensitive, but we lost. And we lost because we had adopted, from what I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we lost because it was in the LCP. And now we've adopted an LCP in the Santa Monica Mountains where we have 3 designations, where we have the H1, the H2, and the H3, and H1 and H2 are both designated as ESHA, but we can allow some development even to the point of a road going through the H1 in order to reach the H3. So I don't understand the discussion that you can't ever disrupt it when we allow LCPs to declare that they're not, that it's not ESHA. And, but I like the idea of us possibly taking a look and possibly having the designations and looking at that H1, H2, H3 as a potential of applying the ESHA designation, because I think that that was very helpful for the landowners in the Santa Monica Mountains. And when I've gone back and looked at applications that were approved in what we would consider sensitive habitat, but now we call ESHA, prior to 2000, and I go back and I look at some of those permits, I'm not sure how it changed so dramatically to the point that now we are, I'll go back to the Crystal Cove thing, where we actually had a area that was graded and rock removed and a new parking lot put in, and the debris was from the grading of the what was not sensitive habitat apparently when we put in the parking lot, and we moved it to a pile, and state parks, being great stewards of the land, took that debris pile and leveled it out and resurfaced it and planted it with native plant species, and it became ESHA. And so I'm very confused, because it almost seems that, especially with the clause that we can call it ESHA even though there's nothing growing there, even though there are no critters there, even though it's a barren space, that it could someday be ESHA. That's where I have my greatest conflict, because I know that if I let my backyard go, it would look dramatically different in 2 years or 3 years. In fact, it would probably be having 99% of it would be what was there originally before I put my grass in. And so and when an area burns and it comes back, we know that happens. So I'm not sure why we are so conflicted in saying, oh, you can't ever touch it, when we know that nature touches it all the time and turns it over. And we've also recognized that there are people with big houses in the Santa Monica Hills that can be in H1, H2, or H3, and they can end up with a road through H1. So I'm confused. I'm not happy with our definition, and I would like to hear the story of how it changed prior to 2000 and how the chaparral was actually adopted on a worldwide basis as opposed to just the state of California, because I think that's very significant. And I think it's also very significant that the Commission has the power to make these determinations, because obviously it did when it switched gears back in. And what alerted me on this is I talked to Sarah Wan one day, and she said, you guys are so lucky to have the ESHA designations that you have now, because we never had that. And I'm like, what? And that's when I started doing a little research and trying to dig back into the archives. So that's I don't even need a response, I don't think. It's just, it seems kind of whimsical on how the determination is. And that's where I am.
Although you don't need one, I'd be happy to give a partial one.
Sure. Please do, Dr. Dixon.
Well, first let me address the idea of designating ESHA because it could someday become ESHA. And we don't do that. The only time that that kind of approach would be used is if it isn't ESHA today because of unpermitted or otherwise not legal activities.
Sure, please respond, but and I think it's
Because
fair. This is why we're here working on this.
I want to reach back to an application that we had that was a man-made ditch One side of the ditch was man-made material, cement or brick or whatever, and the other side was dirt, and it was the ESHA determination was that there may someday be a San Francisco garter snake or a red-legged frog. They hadn't been identified in that area, but it could someday. Am I right? Thank you.
This is in Half Moon Bay.
This was Half Moon Bay, and the determination was not based on the idea that it would someday be ESHA. The determination was that it was on that day ESHA because of the habitat that it provided for snakes and red-legged frogs, and that was based on a determination by both the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife that it was almost certainly used by those species then, although they had not been actually observed there, which is not surprising for the snake because even when it's present, it's almost impossible to observe. But it was probably not used by the frog because it had been looked at, well, it was not frequently used by the frog because it had been looked at from time to time by biologists who certainly would have seen it. So that's a little bit different than having an area like your backyard that if you left it alone would start growing trees. You're lucky. In terms of the effect of such things as burns, that's a much different kind of situation and very complicated, and it should not change the status of the geographic area, the habitat, because those species are actually adapted for the burns and require fire. Many of them require fire in order to germinate. So that is part of a dynamic cycle that occurs naturally. Now what happens with people is we end up having it burn too frequently. And that does change the habitat. And if it's much too frequently, you're very likely to end up with grassland, a non-native grassland. As far as the chaparral and other habitat types in the Santa Monica Mountains, this commission did not designate it as ESHA because of any kind of worldwide comparison. In the staff report, it was noted that that these habitat types were only found in a few places in the world, one of which is California, but it is widespread in California of different types. The reason it was designated in the Malibu LCP was that that particular, the Santa Monica Mountains is an extremely unique place in coastal California. It's surrounded by 17 million people, and yet it is amazingly pristine. And we had testimony from a host of academics who actually studied the plants and animals within that habitat, and they showed that you can't look at each one of these habitat types individually. So the coastal sage scrub and the chaparral and the riparian areas form a complex that when it is in fairly good shape is extremely important for a host of animals. So for example, the birds will go, the chaparral and the coastal sage scrub, they flower at different periods and produce seed at different periods. And birds will predictably, seasonally, go from one habitat type to another. And during the very dry periods, they have a refuge within the riparian areas. And these experts talked about this for amphibians and for birds and for insects. And it was the importance of the complex that was so designated, and it is not designated anyplace else in the state. So we don't call more common types of chaparral ESHA anyplace else. It's the complex in the Santa Monica Mountains that was designated, and I think quite appropriately so. So that's all I have, unless you have some questions of me.
Didn't we say the shrub at Crystal Cove was ESHA because it was scrub?
So I was involved in that project, and it's true that there was an area that was restored by state parks that then subsequently became occupied by California gnatcatchers, nesting gnatcatchers.
Yes, Commissioner Howell?
Thank you, Chair Kinsey, and I hope you'll stick with the adage, there are no stupid questions. I'm confused about the Plant Alliance concept. So, and maybe I just don't get it, but when you said when the needle grass is 1% coverage, it's part of an alliance and it's ESHA. But when the sunflowers, it has to be up to 30%. Why the difference?
Well, that is because of the rules in the Manual of California Vegetation 2 that Todd spent a lot of time talking about in terms of all the research as to what are the dominant species, the constancy, and we could ask him to talk about why there are different percentages, descriptions for the alliances and the subset of associations, if you'd like. I mean, each one of those has very distinct membership rules based on all that research of quantitative sampling. So does that help you understand?
I will do that privately. I know we're only here till Friday.
I mean, it is like the Bible, the book. It is, 2,000 associations and 500 alliances, and all of them have distinct membership rules, and usually a dominant species that has a higher or lower relative cover requirement to be included in that association.
Okay, thank you. One more question, Chair?
Please, yes.
I had a question for Aaron or Chris, I guess, on the LCPs. Because some of these LCPs are really old, so is somewhat following up Commissioner McClure's questions. So is it always dispositive if it's in the LCP as ESHA? I mean, with climate change, maybe things aren't ESHA, and maybe new things are ESHA. Is it dispositive, or can we find, substantial reasons for designating things that aren't ESHA? Not in the LCPs as ESHA.
Good question. And the answer, as a lawyer here, is it depends, as usual. The case there's one case in particular, the S&G case, which Commissioner McClure mentioned, which led to some of the comments I had made. In that case, there was an LCP which not only designated the basic areas where ESHA was, but also very specifically and by name said that one particular area of sand dunes was not ESHA. Now, a project was proposed in that area. It was appealed to the commission, and the commission had determined that actually that area was ESHA. So under those circumstances, the court said no. If the LCP specifically says it's not ESHA, you can't go back and make a new determination on appeal. The fact of the matter is most LCPs aren't quite that specific about what areas are not ESHA. Many of them, especially newer ones, which may not answer your question about older ones, require a case-by-case determination, at the time a permit comes through. So, again, the answer is it depends. In some circumstances, depending how the LCP is written, we certainly would have the chance to go back and look at current circumstances.
And thank you very much, Aaron. Just to add an additional point, there's an additional case that Aaron mentioned during his presentation, the McAllister case, where the Monterey County LCP had provisions related to the protection of ESHA, and it also referred to the Coastal Act provisions related to governing ESHA. Specifically, it had references to Section 30240. The policy language in the Monterey County LCP did not explicitly include the resource-dependent use requirement. So when the commission had originally reviewed that project, it felt it was bound by the policies of that LCP and did not apply that resource-dependent use requirement. It simply looked at whether the development would substantially degrade or disrupt the habitat. On appeal, the court said, no, you have to interpret the LCP. Sorry, is this still, okay. You have to, because of the LCP's references to the Coastal Act provisions, that the commission should have interpreted the LCP consistently with the Coastal Act requirements. So in the absence of explicit language to the contrary, the court directed the commission to.
Hold on.
So the court directed that the commission should interpret the LCP to include that resource-dependent use requirement, even though the policy language didn't actually include that.
Thank you. Commissioner Turnbull-Sanders?
Thank you, staff, for pulling all of this together. It was really helpful. I appreciated the information, and specifically, as a lawyer, I appreciated Mr. Schauman's presentation. Is it possible for us, Jack, maybe to get little name tags for staff that aren't permanently sitting up there? Because I find myself trying to write down staff's names, and sometimes we have, folks that come before us more often, and I'm more familiar with them, but if everybody could just bring like a little name tag with them in their suitcase that's paper or anything like that and just plop it out,
Sure.
I think it would be helpful and for me getting to know staff better too.
We can do that. We've talked about that. We know that character. No, I think it's a good suggestion, and we can do that as we have the staff come up. It'd be a good way for you to put a face with a name, yeah.
Great. So Aaron, is it possible to pull back up that slide presentation that you did on, I'm looking specifically at slide number 12, is that possible to pull up? It was the last one before we broke for discussion, I believe. So the very end of the last presentation.
Chalmers.
It's Chalmers?
Chalmers.
Okay, thank you. So my question is focusing on section 30240 of the Coastal Act and looking at specifically what can be done, or how is ESHA treated when we have potentially resource-dependent uses. And specifically, I was speaking of a case that really frustrated me, and I was trying to kind of make sense of it. And this was a decision that we made on a state parks matter during the time that I was on the commission, and I was criticized heavily for it. And it involved state parks had a parking lot, and adjacent to the parking lot there was a degraded area, and state parks planted native plants in that degraded area, and then the plants flourished and the area that was formerly degraded became ESHA, and the parks wanted to move a trailer, I believe, off of their parking lot and put it in the area that was formerly degraded, but because that area was now designated as ESHA, that little bit of area in the parks could not be used for the trailer. And the parks demonstrated that they had issues with parking, and so the park had become very popular. They needed the space in the parking lot to accommodate the public, and the trailer was going to be used for educational purposes. And so where I find myself having some conflict is sometimes with traditional environmental groups who want to protect environmental habitat and species for for the future of the coast, and I recognize that that's very important, but one of the things that was discussed yesterday in public comment was that people are part of the environment too. And so when we have these conflicts where Parks Agency is trying to provide educational opportunities for its visitors and provide access and create a next generation of stewards for coastal protection, I find it challenging in that particular instance not to be able to simply move a trailer in an adjacent area that maybe perhaps wouldn't have as much impact as some other projects, in the hopes that we would provide educational opportunities, particularly for children. And so in looking at section 30240, one of the ways in which ESHA may be disturbed is for resource-dependent uses. And I see on the slide before us, it says that, okay, so it says only for resource-dependent uses, and I think the following slide has, let's see, or maybe it was the one before that. Sorry, oh, that one where it says resource-dependent uses can include nature trails or public access ways, research or education, and restoration or wildlife management. So I'm just struggling with this idea that, you know, as we face more development and pressure from population growth and expansion, I think we're going to have these conflicts more and more with the designation of ESHA versus trying to find compromises in terms of being able to also have resource-dependent uses so people can actually get to our resources, use them, have educational services provided. So maybe, you know, I don't know that there's a question there, but I'm just struggling a little bit with understanding the parameters of this, the ability for us to provide educational services in our parks, for example.
If memory serves me regarding the details of this project, I think the components of the project that you're talking about was a classroom element, I believe. In addressing the resource-dependent use issue, I think it's important to be looking at exactly what it is that's being proposed, and is that particular thing that is dependent upon the resource. So if there's a proposal for a nature trail just of its very nature is going to have to be going through the habitat, and you have this educational components about you know, what are the plants, what are the values, what are the characteristics of that particular habitat. You know, a classroom, it may be important to have it so that it is close by, so that you can have classes and people can get into the habitat, but the classroom itself isn't inherently dependent on being in that habitat. And I think my recollection of that case was the staff recommendation was there were other places where the classroom could go and still be nearby, still serve an educational function, and that it didn't have to be actually located in that particular area where State Parks was proposing it to be.
And typically, those educational components, when you're looking at trails and things, it's these interpretive signage and that sort of thing in areas where people can observe nature, or boardwalks and things like that. But like Chris said, in the context of a classroom type thing or a larger scale development, there may be options. There are options to keep that out of the ESHA, because that's really not a part of that or dependent on that resource, a classroom. But when you're out in the ESHA, walking through the trails, and you have the interpretive signage and things like that, that is really part of that, of that. That's connected to that resource. So whereas a classroom, plop a classroom in the middle of an ESHA, that really isn't a resource-dependent use, and that's the distinction, I think.
So I guess my challenge with that decision, and I believe I voted to grant the permit, because I believe, based on what State Parks stated, that it was resource dependent and that a classroom in that area was necessary to be in the outdoors. And the other factor that I was looking at was the fact that it was on a previously degraded area, so it was almost as if State Parks was being punished for, replanting, an area that was formerly degraded, as opposed to a virgin, pristine area that was not previously ESHA, and then not being able to make a decision, which, if I remember correctly, based on the circumstances, it was going to be impractical for them to place this educational component anywhere else on the site. And while I believe that staff thought that it could be placed elsewhere, I think the presentation that was given by State Parks was contrary to that. So it's both the question of struggling with this idea of resource-dependent use, and also this idea of treating ESHA the same, whether or not it is formerly degraded, or emanating from a formerly degraded site, or if it's something that is pristine. And I understand that based on what the presentation that we received today, based on the cases as they were presented, and also yesterday when we talked about when we had our other workshop, it seems as if this idea of a degraded site versus one that is not degraded are treated almost the same. And so that's where I'm struggling from a practical standpoint of having, I don't think that logically you can say that a formerly degraded site ESHA on a formerly degraded site should be treated exactly the same as something that had been naturally occurring. Not saying that, the degraded site shouldn't be protected, but I think there are ways to look at this in a little bit more of a nuanced kind of fashion. So that's where I'm struggling with a little bit. I'm not saying you get carte blanche just because an area is degraded and now it's ESHA to mow it over. I'm not saying that at all. But I just think that we have to think about these things with some level of distinction.
I just have a short comment on that. And just to be clear about what the law is in the case law, courts have very clearly said that once an area is designated as ESHA, its status or degraded status is irrelevant. Courts have not ruled definitively on whether or not, or the extent to which its degraded status may affect its ability to be designated as ESHA in the first place. And that, I think the biologist can speak to that issue better than I can.
So just to comment on that, and so I think that would be the area where we would have some level of distinction, is on the designation level. So if the courts have said that once something is designated as ESHA, it's ESHA, I think that we just need to take a careful look on the actual designation on that level.
Can I add a little to that? Okay. So in the situation you're talking about regarding the degraded nature of the area, it really was still coastal sage scrub. The park just enhanced it by removing non-native weeds, and as a result of them enhancing it, it became occupied by coastal gnatcatchers that were in the whole area to begin with, and the area was coastal sage scrub prior to, if you look at it historically. Now, that's not our role in this case. We were looking at what was on the ground now as the biologists, and it was really gorgeous coastal sage scrub because they had done a beautiful job restoring it, and the coastal gnatcatcher, which is a threatened bird that we treat as a rare bird that we need to protect, had taken up root in it. So it was definitely met the definition of ESHA.
Vice Chair Bochco.
Well, thank you again for a great presentation. I've learned so much, and I missed so much because a lot of it went over my head, but it really is helpful, you know, when we read a staff report, to really know what has gone into those designations, at least as presented today. I just have a couple of small questions that may pertain to past cases and maybe some future cases. Going back, I mean, degraded ESHA obviously is a very sensitive area. And I know there's a big difference between degradation because of illegal activity and degradation because of permitted activity. So going towards the permitted activity, where you have land that has over the years been used for whatever purpose, whatever kind of development, and then you want to then use it, let's say, for residences, which we know is very low priority on the list. What does the law say about that kind of ESHA? It's degraded because of nobody's fault, per se, but obviously if left alone, ESHA could bounce back. Is there a court decision about that?
Well, there have been a number of instances, a number of court cases that have dealt with situations where a number of court cases that upheld a particular area as ESHA, even though it was degraded. The Bolsa Chica case, for example, I mean, that area had been used as oil production and agriculture. You know, there's the eucalyptus grove that had been planted 100 years ago. It was obviously declining because of salinity in the soil, but it had still been designated as ESHA, so was still protected. Go ahead.
I think, Dana, that one thing that might help is that we would be doing all this research to determine if what was on the ground actually met the definition of ESHA. And with the MCV2, we have these membership rules. So it could be degraded, and if it's degraded beyond the point of that particular habitat meeting the membership rules, it would no longer rise to the level of ESHA. But if through time a rare bird or a rare plant took up residence and was a thriving population, or not so thriving but was there, it would be ESHA. So for the biologists, our role is just to determine, based on the definition and the presence of animals or their dwellings, whether that site supports ESHA. Okay. So the biologists kind of just look at the facts, and they can be, you know, different people can have different interpretations. So, you know, we Coastal Commission biologists might say that it is ESHA, and a biological consultant may say that it's not, but that we can look at the facts and go back and forth on that.
Right. Well,
does that help?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And the only other question I had is going back to purple needlegrass, because we run into that little flower grass or whatever it is all the time. If purple needlegrass doesn't support any other species, so no gnatcatcher, whatever a species of importance, and it's just purple needlegrass, and I don't mean to degrade plants over animals, but plants can be moved, you know? I mean, they can be taken from one place and transplanted, I guess. And is it just the law that has come down over the years that says we can't move it? Or is it something else, some other policy that I'm missing, that we can't just pick up a plant and put it, you know, an acre away so that it can still thrive, but not right where the guy wants to build his house or whatever?
Well, I suspect it's mainly the law, and I'll leave that to the lawyers, but I would also point out that California Native Plant Society has explicitly addressed this issue and cautions strongly against attempting to do that, because in most cases it fails.
Really? Maybe they don't have the right gardeners.
I'll just briefly address the law on that because there is a case
Okay.
on point, the Bolsa Chica case, excuse me, which I mentioned. And in that case, actually, the commission, had approved an LCP and was trying to be flexible in terms of allowing some development in a eucalyptus grove that had been designated as ESHA, and said, look, we can make other raptor nesting and roosting habitat somewhere else that'll be just as good, if not better. And the court said, no, actually the Coastal Act protects the actual area of ESHA. It doesn't protect simply the value of ESHA. They can, as a sort of fungible good, they can be placed somewhere else. So that's where that rule comes from.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That's very interesting.
Yes, Commissioner Pestor?
Yeah, I think I think the project that Commissioner McClure and Commissioner Turnbull Sanders were referring to on both those cases was the Crystal Cove situation. And as best as I can recall, because this was a long time ago, but I think it had involved parking lot expansion, changes to the restroom, having some administrative offices, making improvements to the pathway to make it more ADA compliant. That's the pathway that loops down and goes underneath Highway 1. And that I think what the commission came up with was restriping the parking lot as opposed to expanding it so there'd be more parking spaces, and then being able to move the educational facility in where the parking lot was going to be expanded to save that area. So it's a complex situation. I'm sure we don't want to rehash the whole project here because it took a long time. But I think it was more than just that one educational facility. So that's all I wanted to mention.
Thank you. I too want to thank everyone for having participated, and I think that it is still quite confusing to a number of us, and I think that that has to do with the fact that, one, there's deep science of which many of us just simply don't have the background to be able to tap into or call upon to help us with these decisions. But as you pointed out, when you can get to situations where as little as 10% of a particular species remains on a highly disturbed area, the common eye may think that this can hardly be characterized as environmentally sensitive habitat when it's surrounded by urban settings and other things. It takes it away from the common understanding, and so if we're driven into this legal and scientific definition of it, it can create confusion or even disagreement, as you pointed out. The Pullman ditch on the Stolowski, the commission said we can't buy it, and we approved the project. The Black Hills Villa, we approved the project. The Naval SEAL training facility, we approved the project. And when we do that, there is a provision that allows you to say that it's the maximum extent feasible. That's what the findings came back to us on the Naval SEAL training, where the staff's findings, written findings, did in fact state that the commission finds this to be ESHA, but in this instance, on a 3-to-1 replacement of 7 acres of Nuttall's Lotus, we find it to be the maximum extent feasible. So I think that from a legal perspective, from a commission staff perspective, it's important to understand that there are times when the sort of common person is going to have an overwhelmingly difficult time agreeing with the scientific and the staff recommendation. And I think that's where we get into trouble. Many times we see beautiful situations that we want to make sure are never touched, are never blemished. It's when we get into areas where it's highly degraded, it's been heavily used. The Naval Training Facility had been used as an enormously active site for decades. Radio towers, roadways, buildings, water lines, if you remember, there was a lot there. And so we couldn't swallow it, and when we were told that when the Navy replaces or removes ice plant, Nuttall's Lotus is the first thing to come rushing in. And so I think that these are the areas where the commission, this commission at least, is going to be struggling with the balancing. And you did talk about the balancing provisions, but that doesn't in effect undermine the ESHA determination. And I think maybe it would be helpful for Jack to discuss that just a little bit more with us in terms of that section of the code where the legislature says that in carrying out the provisions, we should, on balance, most protect the significant coastal resources, but then follows with the broader policies serve to concentrate development in close proximity to urban and employment centers may be more protective overall than the specific wildlife habitat. So how has the staff and the commissions in the past used that, and in what situations do they draw upon that portion of the act?
And you're balancing against different sections of the Coastal Act. One of the easy example, most recent examples are some of these highway projects with Caltrans, where we're balancing some expansion of the highway as well as a number of other access improvements, yet we're impacting ESHA or maybe agricultural lands or wetlands. We're balancing the ESHA provision, those policies, ESHA, wetlands.
Resource protection.
Against access. And what's most protective of resources in this case is expanding the access there and improving that, as well as, at the same time, mitigating for those impacts. So that's a good example of a balancing provision in that case. So it's not just that in some cases, it's just because of convenience, there's no other policy you're balancing against. If it's a straight ESHA call, it might be a takings issue, for example, in the Santa Monica Mountains. We use a more programmatic approach to dealing with takings law. It wasn't a balancing. There was some balancing provisions in there with regard to concentration and development, transfer development credit programs that we developed as part of that overall LCP to protect certain areas and concentrate development in other areas through this transfer development credit program. So it's those types of things. So
That's
Chris
helpful.
may have some other thoughts on that. It's a complicated, it can be confusing to the layperson about what is balancing.
Amen. Chris.
Yeah, just to slightly elaborate on that, to get into the balancing situation, the commission first needs to find that there is a conflict between Chapter 3 policies. So a situation where either denial of a project would be inconsistent with the Chapter 3 policy, or approval of that project would be inconsistent with the Chapter 3 policy. In that situation, you really do have a conflict where no matter what the commission does, it's taking an action that's inconsistent with some requirements of the Coastal Act. And in those situations, then the statute allows the commission to then balance those policies and make a determination about what is on balance most protective of significant coastal resources.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I would say to try and give the staff and the public back some of the commission's thinking is that the consistency issue as well. The San Dieguito Lagoon, not too long ago, we approved a trail along the edge of the lagoon. And we found the vegetation types that are typically associated with ESHA, but in that instance, the recommendation was not to define it as ESHA because it was fragmented. So sometimes it's difficult for us to understand, well, when is a fragmented situation such that it doesn't rise to the level of coastal resources, where in other highly disturbed and fragmented areas, it's viewed as being eligible for ESHA?
Well, it's obviously a continuum, and it differs according to the species or the habitat type. I can think of at one end, the Ventura Marsh milk vetch, I believe was the name of the plant, was growing on a toxic waste site. And it was declared ESHA. It was was a terrible-looking place, and it was isolated, but it just happened to be the only living representative of that species. So that's at the far end. And
3-to-1 restoration, would you have to go create more dumps?
that was it, protected in place, and then the resource agencies have been busy planting it in all kinds of places that they think are appropriate for it. In each of these cases, we look at the site, and we kind of look at the size of it, and we look at how much of that habitat type or species is present. So in the case of a very, very rare plant, it doesn't take too much for it to be considered ESHA, even though it's isolated and degraded. Whereas with something like coastal sage scrub, that we've had, probably 90% loss or more in the coastal zone. Nonetheless, it's still relatively abundant. And if within an area where there's quite a lot of it, if there are small patches, one would perhaps not call it ESHA. Well, also, there was an area called Catellus in the Los Angeles area, south of Marina del Rey, and the hillside above Ballona wetlands there had at one time been coastal sage scrub. There were scattered coastal sage scrub plants around. Fish and wildlife folks looked at it and didn't think it was important. I looked at it and felt that it didn't raise to the level of ESHA because it was so degraded that it really didn't meet the definition of the habitat anymore. We were actually sued on that, but won in trial court. So unfortunately, we don't have a formula. It depends on what is there and the situation of the particular place.
I think that's.
And then we do our best and bring it to you, and you either agree with us or you don't.
Right, and I think that is the best summary. That it requires a lot of science and a lot of consideration, and it involves a lot of minds thinking about it at any given time. Sometimes it's obvious, other times it isn't. And, the value of having this kind of a workshop, I think, brings that to the fore, both in terms of where it originates from in the Coastal Act, how it's supported by other agencies like our guests today, and how we ultimately, as a commission, have to wrestle with some of these things. And I think for the public's benefit, the areas where I see the greatest uncertainty lies in the areas where the commission is looking on the edges or within the urbanized areas and highly disturbed sites, as for the most part. And so with that, if there are no other commissioner comments, I want to thank everyone. And we're not allowed to clap. But we'll take a brief break and then come back and see if we can get back on a schedule that looks like we can finish today. Thank you.